Beyond the walls of the majestic castle owned by his father, terrifying secrets were hidden, born from his sensual and hedonistic fantasies. However, his father could not keep these secrets hidden forever. One day, a maid, overwhelmed with horror, fled the palace and managed to return to her family, where she revealed her sinister story. This story sank deep into the hearts of his relatives and remained etched in their bones, like a cold wind that pierced through the human soul. This story is part of the family chronicle, as his parents, members of the upper class, had their own unique destiny. The boy's mother was French, descending from a distant branch of the royal dynasty. She was close to Princess Dondi, serving as her lady-in-waiting, and therefore the boy was born in the luxurious apartments of the Dondi Hotel in Paris, the French capital. His father, Count Dadi, enjoyed his wife's wealth and lived in one of the most opulent palaces in France. When the boy was only a few years old, his father suddenly abandoned the family, neglecting his son's future. In despair, his mother later entered a monastery, leaving the boy entirely alone in the splendid halls of the hotel. The household staff surrounded the young heir with tenderness and overprotectiveness, practically corrupting him, stealing his childhood, and turning him into a sort of little god. He grew up spoiled, allowed to do anything, no prohibitions, no boundaries. Another boy living within the palace walls was Louis Joseph de Bourbon, Prince Coney, the closest relative of the king. He was roughly the same age as the boy. Hoping to foster friendship, the boy's tutors believed these children could become good friends and support each other in the future. However, there was one overlooked detail. At any age, the palace son, young Donian, did not get along with others. He was not known for good manners and rarely found common ground with his peers. One day, a quarrel erupted between him and the prince. The prince believed that, being older and more important, he should have the upper hand. But the boy, accustomed to getting his way, refused to concede. He became angry, and his rage spiraled out of control. In a fit of fury, he attacked the prince and mercilessly beat him, nearly to death. Soon, the household staff and servants, furious beyond measure, intervened and tore the boy away from the prince, leaving him in a deplorable state that even his family members found alarming, considering the potential long-term health consequences. As he grew older, his inner world increasingly descended into chaos. His father's absence throughout his life left only a faint hope for a new beginning. Later, his uncle, a wealthy and influential man, did his best to help the young heir by teaching him and guiding him onto a path of virtue and reason. But when it was time for the boy to receive a proper education, his uncle decided to send him to the renowned French school of Lys Louis, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life and new challenges. When it comes to a prestigious secondary school located in the very heart of Paris and still in operation today, one immediately recalls the surprisingly fortunate fate of its founder, the marquis' father. His arrival at the school in youth was a real surprise to everyone. Surrounded by loyal servants who unconditionally obeyed his every whim, as if they were subject solely to his will. However, the situation within the school walls was quite different. Where strictness and discipline were the norms, students who dared to break the rules became objects of harsh punishment. For serious misconduct, boys and girls were subjected to whipping, an act which, at the time, was perhaps quite an effective deterrent. But for the young marquis, this disrupted his usual routine, and he became increasingly interested in the matter. Whipping became not just an outlet for him, but an obsession. It soon turned into an important part of his deviant behavior that accompanied him throughout his life. Teachers, unaware that all this was shaping a monster, soon noticed that excessive and brutal beatings gradually fostered a dark and malevolent nature within him. When the time came to choose a wife, the Marquis' father married Lady Montrey in 1763, during the height of French aristocratic luxury and splendor. It seemed that their union was a tender fairy tale event, similar to the plots of fairy tales and romantic legends. However, behind this beautiful picture lay a truly terrifying story. This aristocratic marriage produced two sons and one daughter, but deep down it was neither warm nor harmonious. In the following years, the Marquis' father spent almost all his time in Paris, where he began to indulge in increasingly daring manifestations of his deviance. He gained notoriety for his libertine lifestyle and openness to immoral passions, making him quite well known in the city's circles. His behavior became so provocative and scandalous that the local authorities had to start monitoring his actions. He was involved in several brief criminal cases until the Parisians reached their limit of tolerance, and he was exiled to his castle in Lacoste, completely cut off from further contact. But, of course, this was only the beginning. His true awakening occurred only after his father's death in 1767. At that time, his father held the title of Count, but the young man, having changed his name from Dadaan to a more imposing one, Marquis, quickly realized that this title sounded more attractive to him and, for some reason, even more fitting. Part 3 of 9. Raised amidst luxury and caprice, spoiled and quick-tempered, the young man gradually developed a tendency towards sadistic inclinations. Behind the walls of Lacoste Castle, he began to persistently explore his most wild desires. He hired only the most attractive young men and women, forcing them to participate in his scandalous and depraved games, turning the castle into a place where complete freedom reigned for his dark fantasies and insane experiments. Over time, the Marquis Dada's activities crossed all boundaries, and he began to behave so recklessly that it caused genuine horror. He forced a woman to participate in his bedroom games, which involved cult symbols such as a cross, shocking her to her core. The woman was so deeply shocked and frightened by this that she ultimately ran away from the castle, literally fleeing to a place where she could find safety. She headed straight into the hands of the authorities. Following this event, law enforcement stormed the house, arrested its owner, that is, his father, and chained him up, subsequently charging him with offending religion, which at that time was considered an extremely serious crime. Over time, the Marquis's actions became increasingly alarming and horrifying. In the following years, he embodied depravity and abuses, and in the year 1768, he was once again chained, this time as a result of another arrest. One of his maids, who managed to escape, reached out to the authorities and told them a terrifying story. There were imprisonments, torture, the use of knives, and wax melted by candles. 2 years later, in 1772, he and his servant named Later were found guilty of sodomy with 4 women. In that era, the punishment for such a crime was execution, and for the first time in a long while, in the eyes of the law, Marquis Dada truly faced the brink of death. This meant he had only one option: to flee. And that's exactly what he did. Together with Later, they fled abroad, escaping their pursuers and hiding in Italy. However, their escape didn't last long, and soon fate brought them back into the hands of justice. They were soon imprisoned, this time in the fortress of Milan, located in the Sceaux region of France. The Marquis, being a very clever and resourceful man, along with Later, managed to escape from the fortress after 4 months of captivity and secretly returned to their homeland, Lacoste. There he was reunited with his wife, and once again, an era of insane entertainment began at Lacoste Castle. And if anyone assumes that his wife was merely a witness or a victim in all these events, they are mistaken. In fact, she actively participated in many of his immoral ventures, playing a key role in their execution. Part 4 of 9. One might think that the death sentence hanging over the Marquis would have softened him and made him cautious to avoid further trouble, but that was far from the case. His next series of misconduct included the kidnapping and imprisonment of an entire group of women and a man for an entire 7 weeks. Such madness, bordering on outright anarchy, is hard to call entertainment. It was a true criminal offense. And since kidnapping and confinement were, according to the laws of that time, serious crimes, Marquis Dade once again found himself on the run. He escaped to Italy, hoping to find refuge there from justice and to recover after the new dramatic events. But even while abroad, the marquis could not resist his dark passions and temptations for long. His ties to depraved pleasures were too strong. Sometimes, it was precisely in the Château de la Coste that he found his true happiness. It was his temple, where he indulged in his passionate perversions once again, regardless of the dangers threatening him and the constant efforts of the law to put an end to his madness. Returning from Italy in 1810, after nearly a decade spent on the run and avoiding the consequences of his actions, he seemed to feel invincible. His life resembled an endless game with fate, in which he often emerged victorious. However, soon fate prepared an unexpected and harsh scenario. Suddenly, his game could come to an end. Upon hearing that his gravely ill mother wished to see him one last time, to say farewell and perhaps to explain himself, he set off for Paris. Unaware that this might be a trap, he packed his suitcase and headed to meet his destiny. In reality, he became the victim of a cunning plan. Ultimately, he was cleverly lured into a trap used to catch fugitive criminals. And although it was hard to deny that his actions often deserved harsh punishment, it could not be overlooked that his deception was a cruel blow he clearly did not expect. Once in Paris, he was immediately rearrested. During that time, after numerous detentions, such incidents were not new to him. But this time, the situation was more complicated. At least by 1817, after he successfully appealed his case and was finally released, it seemed that all obstacles were behind him. He could have returned to Lacoste and resumed his distraction activities, which had long become a habitual way of life. But in reality, none of this was foreseen. The actions of his relatives and trustees proved against him. His mother-in-law, Madame de Montreuil, personally wrote to King Louis XVI, requesting that he remain in custody. He might have deserved freedom if he had simply shown genuine remorse for his actions and admitted his guilt. However, this was one of the few things that the bright and carefree marquis categorically rejected. In 1723, already in the midst of an 11-year imprisonment, he wrote a letter to his wife stating, "Either kill me or accept me as I am. I will not change." He was transferred from one fortress to another until he finally found himself in the notorious Bastille Tower in Paris. It was at this moment that his main work was conceived, the famous 120 Days of Sodom. If you're curious about its content, you can look up the details yourself. The only thing that matters is that the content fully matches known expectations and notions. Obviously, if one of his guards had discovered what he was writing, it could have led to serious trouble or even a death sentence. In isolation while confined, he managed to obtain an extraordinarily long, continuous strip of paper. Using tiny handwriting, he wrote on a long strip, trying to fit his ill-fated work onto a single sheet. When guards or overseers were on duty, he would write very quietly and carefully, completely controlling each letter to avoid suspicion. Wrapping the piece of paper tightly into a dense roll, he hid it carefully in a crack in the wall, hoping for long-term preservation. This clever plan was quite effective for some time. However, in 1789, difficult times arrived. At that time, after many years of imprisonment, he finally managed to leave his prison cell, but not as he had imagined. His heroic efforts only partially succeeded. He raised a commotion behind the fortress walls, loudly shouting toward the gathered crowd at the window to inform them that maimed prisoners were being killed indiscriminately. This nervous intervention caused the guards, exhausted and irritated, to immediately target him. He was taken out of his cell and hurriedly led away to a psychiatric hospital in the town of Chanteau. Such a hasty convoy's route deprived him of the opportunity to reveal his handwritten legacy. He was never able to produce a complete draft. Yet, in the same year, just 10 days after the tragic death of King Louis XVI, an epical storm erupted. The storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Understanding how revolutionaries viewed nobles and the aristocracy, it can be said that it would have been better if the Marquis's father had not appeared at that decisive moment. When he heard about the fortress's fall, in the deepest despair he believed that his manuscript, his critically important creative work, would surely perish amidst the raging events. He even thought that his legacy would disappear forever. What he did not know was that, 2 days before the uprising, a man named Ari de Sam Maximene found and secretly stole his manuscript within the walls of the fortified stronghold. This person took the scroll from the underground detention chambers and saved it from the destructive wave of revolutionary upheaval. Circumstances in the country were changing rapidly. Revolutionary upheavals meant that Marcus the Elder had a rare opportunity to start a new life. In 1789, just a few months after the overthrow of the monarch, he realized that the authorities no longer detained him. The absence of royal interference freed him. Over these 11 years, significant changes had taken place. His wife, finally tired of his behavior, filed for divorce, and his beloved Chateau de la Coste, was plundered by revolutionaries. He had to move back to Paris, where he was doomed to start over. But perhaps the most fundamental shift was that, in the age of revolution, nobles and aristocrats became targets of the system. The personal well-being and safety of Marquis the Elder were under threat. He had to play very carefully to avoid ending up under the guillotine, fate that many suspicious or unpopular nobles faced under the new rulers. To survive and preempt new dangers, he decided to change his image and name. "Farewell, Marquis the Elder," he told himself. And "hello, citizen." This was his expression of support for the new Republican government, feeling that his participation in political life now had to proceed differently. He even managed to hold several official positions in the new government, despite his noble roots. In fact, at one point it seemed that Marcus the Elder was transforming from a mysterious and enigmatic figure into a quite ordinary bureaucrat. During this period, his existence seemed entirely mundane, evidence that the era shift could extinguish even the brightest personalities, turning them into examples of social past. Fisher Shaken, with his wife Marie Constance Ken, a former actress, and their 6-year-old son, rarely appeared in public and tried to stay in the shadows. However, he was never able to completely rid himself of his vulgar passions. He continued writing his salacious novels, publishing them anonymously to hide his involvement. As the reign of terror extended further and grew increasingly brutal, he began to criticize the new regime, especially the ruthless Maximilien Robespierre, which quickly led to his troubles. Authorities swiftly deprived him of his positions and re-imprisoned him, where he spent nearly a year. By 1796, his situation had become so hopeless that he was forced to sell his beloved castle, Chateau de la Coste, long ruined and lost its former glory. Returning to Paris, he became an orphan, painfully eking out a modest existence, barely making ends meet. Nevertheless, during this difficult period, he managed to publish his 2 most popular works, Justina's and Juliet. Like all his books, these works aroused shock and bewilderment among readers. Unfortunately for his reputation, among those involved in his readership was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was firmly determined not to let the author of such scandalous and provocative works wander freely across the country. In 1502, by his order, the authorities took strict control over the person responsible for writing those books, and soon they found and arrested the writer. The main reason was rumors that he supposedly seduced young prisoners, which of course only further damaged his reputation. Everything happened very quickly. He was placed in the sinister Biskra psychiatric hospital. Dada's family convinced the authorities of his insanity, and he was transferred to a clinic in Shantung, where he had been confined many years earlier. There, his treatment was noticeably softer, and he was allowed to behave with more freedom. Moreover, he managed to persuade the management that his beloved Maria Constance was his relative, and he was permitted to live there with her. After everything he had gone through, this seemed to him more like a rest than a punishment, albeit with some difficulties. Despite this, Dada continued to get into trouble. One of the few who supported him during this difficult period was the director of Shantung, Ebo de Kir, a man with quite progressive views for his time. He encouraged Dada's activities as a form of therapy, and even allowed him to stage several of his plays in front of an audience, using other patients as actors. Dada's plays were as openly depraved as his books, and they did not hide their shocking content. It wasn't long before the authorities took measures to put an end to their activities forever. They demanded that Kyer place the father in solitary confinement and deprive him of pen and paper, which was especially strictly enforced in the last years of the old man's life. During this period, although constantly guarded, the father developed an intimate and forbidden obsession, a relationship with a 14-year-old girl named Mellon Lear, the daughter of a Guaranton employee. Their connection lasted a full 4 years, despite terrible laws and moral condemnations. However, after 70 years of uninterrupted debauchery, perversions, and abnormal acts, fate changed its mind. The father of the great marquis was finally arrested and died on December 12th of the 18th century at the age of 74. As a result of this entire secret life, spent behind the walls of secluded fortresses and psychiatric clinics across France, he was confined for nearly 29 years. He endured immense suffering, and despite his literary legacy, numerous books and manuscripts, most of his work was lost forever, largely due to the cruel treachery of his son. Indeed, during the most difficult period of his father's life, his son's attitude toward him was far from warm. As soon as the father died, the son unhesitatingly burned all remaining manuscripts, unwilling to let any testimony of his past become a source of shame for the family. Thus, the Marquis de Sade disappeared from history. His name was practically erased. The family did everything possible to erase his memory, as if he never existed, and they nearly succeeded. For almost 100 years, the personality and works of Sade remained almost entirely unknown to the world, thanks to the family's efforts to maintain silence and block access to his creations. The few manuscripts that survived were kept in the renowned section of the National Library of Paris, known as the Hell or Inferno Department. However, in the second half of the 20th century, one descendant, Zede Vredis, became interested in his ancestor. At that time, he knew nothing about the Marquis until in 1940, he began research and discovered a hidden stash of folders and manuscripts belonging to his father, concealed in the family castle. With the help of scholars, he managed to publish these materials and tirelessly worked throughout his life to finally reveal the true identity and legacy of the great Marquis de Sade to the world. Thanks to the efforts of his descendants, in recent years, the name and works of this person have gained well-deserved recognition. The family continues to exploit his legend by creating commercial ventures based on his image and profiting from his fame and reputation, fabricating new stories and popularizing his name. A line of luxury products called Maon de Sade has appeared, along with a winery branded Sade Winery, decorated with a distinctive symbol or signature called a mark on its bottles. This happened in connection with the terrible deeds he committed against his unwitting servants. The story of Maria, a maid who suffered at his hands, is particularly remembered. For his heinous crimes, he seemed to receive a relatively lenient punishment. However, years earlier, his life nearly ended in an assassination attempt. One of the maids, who escaped from his castle and took refuge in her hometown, told her family about Mark's actions. Her father, upon hearing about the atrocities, was horrified and deeply outraged, as the authorities' inaction, unable to stop Mark, only fueled his rage. Consequently, the man decided he must put an end to the villain himself. He traveled to Lacoste with a single purpose: to take revenge on the criminal. Armed with a pistol, the maid's father went to meet Mark, sincerely hoping for justice. He was prepared to act and carried bullets specifically for that purpose. As he approached Mark closely enough to touch him, the man pulled out his weapon and fired. However, miraculously, the gun misfired. It jammed or the bullet diverted, causing no harm to Mark. This unexpected outcome repeatedly saved his life. It seemed as though fate was not merely watching over him, but was aided by a more powerful force, whether a guardian angel or a sinister demon. From time to time, his fate appeared to play along, granting him a long chance to escape the villain. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more similar tales, you can see it as an example of how fate and chance sometimes play their mysterious role in people's lives.